The night air was sharp, cutting through the tattered fabric of his hoodie like knives of ice. He pulled it tighter around himself, but it was useless. The cold had a way of finding its way in, creeping through every tear, every exposed patch of skin. His fingers were stiff, barely able to hold onto the old backpack that contained everything he owned. Everything. That word used to mean so much more. A home, a bed, a family. Now it was reduced to a few crumpled dollar bills, a notebook filled with dreams that seemed further away than ever, and a few pieces of clothing that smelled of the streets. He sat on the cracked sidewalk, his back against the brick wall of a convenience store that had long since closed for the night. The neon sign above him flickered, buzzing intermittently, casting a weak red glow over the pavement. The streets weren't empty, but they might as well have been. People walked by, some in a hurry, others lost in their own world. Nobody looked down, nobody noticed him. He had become invisible, a shadow blending into the city's underbelly, just another forgotten soul in a world that never stopped moving. His stomach growled, a deep, aching reminder that he hadn't eaten since the morning, if half a stale sandwich counted as a meal. Hunger had become an old companion, gnawing at him, but never quite strong enough to break him. He had learned to push it aside, to let it become background noise, but tonight it was louder than usual. Across the street, the glow of a small diner called to him like a lighthouse in a storm. The windows were fogged from the warmth inside, a contrast to the biting cold of the night. The smell of greasy fries and fresh coffee drifted through the air, teasing him, mocking him. His eyes lingered on the sign in the window. Help wanted. He exhaled, his breath forming a thin cloud in the cold air. How many times had he seen signs like that? How many times had he walked in, hopeful, only to be met with disapproving stares and polite but firm rejections? He had stopped counting after the 10th time. People didn't hire someone who had no address, no references, no clean clothes. But what choice did he have? He stood, wincing as his joints protested the movement. His legs were stiff from sitting too long on the hard pavement. The soles of his shoes were worn thin, barely holding together. He took a deep breath and crossed the street, dodging a passing car whose driver barely acknowledged him. The bell above the diner door jingled as he stepped inside, and for a moment warmth wrapped around him like an old friend. The scent of food was overwhelming, his stomach twisting in response. The waitress behind the counter glanced at him, her expression unreadable. She was older, maybe in her late 40s, her hair pulled back into a bun, lines of exhaustion etched onto her face. A few customers sat at booths, talking in low voices, barely noticing him. He hesitated at the entrance, suddenly aware of how he must look, unkempt, exhausted, out of place. But he forced himself forward. The waitress raised an eyebrow as he approached the counter. "Help you, hon?" His voice almost failed him. It had been a while since he had spoken to anyone who actually wanted an answer. He cleared his throat. "I saw the sign," he said, nodding toward the window. "Are you still hiring?" She gave him a once-over, her eyes lingering on his worn clothes, his unshaven face. He braced himself for the familiar response, the hesitation, the polite rejection. But instead she sighed, grabbing a rag and wiping down the counter. "You ever worked in a diner before?" He shook his head. "No, but I can learn. I can do anything." She studied him for a long moment. Then, to his surprise, she jerked her head toward the back. "Come on, let's see if you can wash dishes." He blinked, unsure if he had heard her correctly. "Wait, you mean I got the job?" She smirked. "You got a chance. Whether you keep it depends on how good you are at scrubbing plates." He didn't hesitate. For the first time in a long while, he felt something he had nearly forgotten: hope. And so, with shaky hands and a pounding heart, he followed her into the kitchen, stepping into what might be the first real opportunity he had in years. The steam from the dishwater rose in thick clouds, filling the small kitchen with the scent of soap and leftover food. His hands, already red and raw from hours of scrubbing, dipped into the hot water again, grasping another greasy plate. He worked in silence, the clatter of dishes and the distant hum of customers' voices, his only company. Every movement was deliberate, every scrub an act of quiet determination. This was his chance, and he wasn't going to waste it. He had expected the first day to be hard, but nothing prepared him for the exhaustion that came with standing for hours, hunched over a sink, the heat of the kitchen pressing against him like a relentless weight. But he welcomed it. It was better than the cold streets, better than the empty nights, wondering where his next meal would come from. The owner of the diner, a burly man with graying hair and tired eyes, stepped into the kitchen. He gave a nod of acknowledgement, then reached for a cup of coffee, watching for a moment as the new hire worked. "You ever done hard work before?" the man asked. He nodded without looking up. "Not like this, but I'm learning," the owner grunted. "You're slower than the last guy, but at least you're not complaining." He didn't have the luxury of complaining. He had spent too many nights on the pavement, too many mornings waking up to aching bones and an empty stomach. This job, as small as it seemed, was everything. Days turned into weeks. The soreness in his body became familiar, almost comforting. He learned quickly how to stack dishes efficiently, how to clear tables when the servers were too busy, how to make himself useful in ways that didn't require being asked. The first paycheck came, a small sum but more money than he had held in his hands in a long time. He stared at it for a long moment, the weight of it unreal. It wasn't much, but it was proof. Proof that he was no longer completely lost. Proof that he was earning his way back into the world. Instead of spending it on comfort, he made a decision. The library down the street became his second home. He spent hours there after his shift, devouring books on business, finance, and personal development. He wasn't just going to survive, he was going to build something better for himself. The manager at the diner noticed his effort. One evening, as he finished wiping down the last table, she tossed him a set of keys. "Open tomorrow," she said simply. He caught the keys, confusion flickering across his face. "You're serious?" She smirked. "You've earned it." That night, he sat on the steps of the library, staring up at the city skyline. He was still a long way from where he wanted to be, but for the first time in years, he felt something powerful in his chest. A future, and he was going to fight for it. The early morning air was crisp, carrying the familiar scent of the city waking up. He stepped out of the sleek black car, his polished shoes tapping against the pavement. The world felt different now, yet somehow, standing in front of this small diner, it was as if time had folded in on itself. He could still remember the first time he had walked through those doors, cold, hungry, and desperate for a chance. Back then, this place had been his lifeline. Today, it was a reminder of just how far he had come. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit, his fingers grazing the smooth fabric. It was a stark contrast to the tattered hoodie and worn-out sneakers he had once worn. He had lost count of the nights he had spent scrubbing dishes in that tiny kitchen, pushing through exhaustion, forcing himself to believe that hard work would lead him somewhere better. And now, standing here, he knew that every aching muscle, every sleepless night, every sacrifice had been worth it. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside. The warmth of the diner embraced him instantly, carrying the scent of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon. It was exactly as he remembered. The same checkered floor, the same faded menus taped to the walls, the same hum of conversation from customers starting their day. He scanned the room, his eyes landing on a familiar face behind the counter. The waitress, the same one who had given him his first shot, was pouring coffee into a customer's mug, her hair still pulled back into that tight bun. She looked older now, a few more wrinkles around her eyes, but her presence was just as steady as it had been all those years ago. He felt a strange sense of gratitude wash over him. She glanced up and met his eyes. For a moment there was no recognition, just the usual polite acknowledgement she gave to any customer. But then something flickered across her face, a hint of familiarity, a ghost of a memory. "Can I get you something, hun?" she asked, wiping her hands on a towel. He smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "Just coffee." She nodded, grabbing a mug and pouring the dark liquid with practiced ease. As she set it in front of him, her gaze lingered on his face. "You look familiar," she murmured, narrowing her eyes slightly. "Have we met before?" He let out a soft chuckle, wrapping his hands around the warm mug. "Yeah, a long time ago." She tilted her head, trying to place him, and then, like a puzzle clicking into place, her eyes widened. Her hand flew to her chest as she gasped. "No way! It's you!" He nodded. "It's me." For a moment, she just stared at him, as if trying to reconcile the man sitting in front of her with the young, desperate kid who had once stood in this very spot, asking for a job. "Look at you," she finally breathed. "You made it." His throat tightened slightly. He had imagined this moment before, wondered what it would feel like to come back and show her what had become of the chance she had given him. But standing here now, he realized it wasn't about proving anything. It was about honoring the journey. "I wouldn't have, if you hadn't given me that first opportunity," he admitted. "You didn't have to take a chance on me, but you did." She waved a hand as if brushing off the sentiment, but there was a glimmer of emotion in her eyes. "All I did was give you a shot. You did the rest." He reached into his wallet and pulled out a crisp $100 bill, sliding it across the counter. "For the coffee," he said with a smirk. She scoffed, pushing it back toward him. "Oh, come on now, this isn't necessary." But he shook his head, his expression turning serious. "It is. Consider it a thank you." She hesitated, then finally accepted it, tucking it into her apron pocket with a small nod of appreciation. "So," she said, leaning on the counter, "tell me, what have you been up to all these years?" He exhaled, glancing around the diner one last time. "Building something, learning, making sure I never go back to where I started." She smiled knowingly. "Well, whatever you're doing, keep at it. You turned out all right." He lifted his coffee cup in a silent toast before taking a sip. The taste was rich and familiar, grounding him in a moment that felt both surreal and deeply real. He had come full circle, and this was just the beginning.